for me to be here is pretty much a miracle. I was a shoe-shining boy when I was 8 years old. So just for me to be here and be able to do what I do is nothing less than a miracle and a gift to be here. Yeah, my name is Cláudio Carvalhaes. I'm originally from São Paulo, Brazil. And I came to United States when I was 24 to be a pastor of a local non-documented immigrant community. So I did this reverse kind of mission within the Presbyterian Church who came to Brazil in 1859. So then I am one of the first ones to do the reverse movement to work with immigrant communities here. And then after 5 years there in Massachusetts, I got my scholarship at Union. I got this full scholarship to do my PhD. And so I worked in the fields of theology and liturgy with Dr. Dolores Williams and Dr. Janet Walton. After that, I went to teach at Louisville Seminary in Kentucky, and then to Lutheran Seminary in Philadelphia, and now I am at McCormick Seminary in Chicago. So I grew up in the church, and the church for me was always fundamental because I got everything from the church. I mean, my first toy came from the people of the church, the clothes and food and friendship and love and care, stories and singing and all of that. All of the course that I did was with the help of the church. So the church for me was a place in the world, a world that would rather exclude me. So the church kind of include me and put me into the fold. And working early in life was to help the family to find ways to also to live and so yeah, I did that, and I started working full time when I was 13, and I finished from seventh grade to end of high school. I studied in the evening, and then did my theological studies also the same way, working from 8 to 6, and then doing my studies from 7 to 11, from pretty much the 7th grade until the end of my theological studies. And then, then I had this gift of being able to move and go other places. And I think coming here as a missionary was very strange in many ways, right? But it was wonderful to work with this community that I see that I belong to, the non-documented community who pretty much runs a lot of this country in their backs. And so I feel and I believe that I belong to these people. And so even though I am not one of the non-documented, so I am very privileged in that sense, in that way. I am a citizen here now. But as always, I consider myself as a foreign citizen. But in the words of Stuart Mill, but that's where I try to work from my Latina community and from the other minorities communities. I feel that I belong to those places at the fringes, and since I received this gift, I think what I need to do is to be with them, to be a voice, to be a way of empowering, reshaping, redistributing somewhat, somehow, the resources to those communities, so that they can actually also be put back into the fold as well. So in some ways, I think what I do is to repeat what the church had done to me, and so I try to do that in a larger sense of my way of living and work. So that's why my scholarship and my activism is just one thing. I don't do liberation theology just because there's a cool methodology in it, but it's a matter of survival. It's a matter of survival. It's a matter of being in touch with my communities, and so my scholarship and who I am and what I do, I can only have voice because of this community. Otherwise, I wouldn't have my own voice. So the issues of borders, I think it's globalization has put down some borders as it erased many others. Being here is part of this new global movement, right? That there's this possibility for some to move around, but because I am pretty much marked by the borders, right? And so even my scholarship, it is in the borderlands. I live in the borderlands, and so there's this whole scholarship based in the borderlands, Gloria and Zaldúa, and so many of the Latina community also talk about that. And so how do I live and how do I think from and within the shadows of these borders, being part of different worlds at the same time, not belonging to none of them, and wrestling with the ambiguities and paradoxes that makes me and my community who we are, wrestling with the oppositions of it, and the curses and the blessings of being in this place, and so being here is being marked by those borders, right? And so it is as if when I want to take my students to go to the borders between Mexico and the United States, and so walk around the borders and then try to talk about God and about Christian beliefs under that shadow. How do we pray under that shadow? What kind of statement do we need to make? How would our ritual movements that sustains our lives would be done under that shadow of those borders, and then see how those borders also connect with other borders of other kinds of oppression. So how those borders engage with the borders between patriarchy and the borders of between heterosexuality and queerness and homosexualities, and how does that have to do with race also, and how the borders are so much vivid in terms of class distinctions so clearly as well, and how based on the economics that raises so many borders and literally to keep some people in and to keep some people away. So those are the things that interests me. So how, like when we look at our situation in the United States now, how the whole lack of immigrant policy it is a way of keeping the boundaries so that this 11 million people, undocumented people, would not have access to the sources of this country, while they are fundamental to this country to keep the system going. And it is funny that the country doesn't know where 11 million people are. Right? They could find Obama, but they cannot find 11 million people within this country. So of course they are needed here. Just for one example, if you give documents and citizenship to these 11 million people, so they will have to have minimum wage. And if they have to have minimum wage because they are paid much low salaries so the increase of the inflation would be such that it would break the economy. So there's always this interest. So how the borders that are raised are just, some of them are fake ones so that they can keep the system. Another borders that are so much clear in this country now is the racial borders that are so much a part of the constitution of who we are. So how we are literally creating jail systems as borders to put a group of people, blacks, within this border so they won't be living around us. And the whole sense of the borders in the prison system around the borderline between U.S. and Mexico with the private prisons. There's a bad mandate that every night they have to have a certain number, more than 30,000 people inside of those jails so that they can profit from it. So borders are everywhere. And then it goes also from within our worship services. Why in some places people who do not follow the normativity of heterosexuality cannot be part of it. How there are so many borders around, for instance, the Eucharistic table, and that's why my book. And so how is it that some women cannot access? Why is it that some kind of classes cannot access, if not within their own? So those are the complications of the racialized, gendered, sexualized, classed markers of the borders that we live everywhere. I think the fundamental part of my interest in dealing with liturgies, in dealing with rituals, it's to see the ways in which we embody that which we believe, and we are embodied by the larger embodiment, and how do we respond. So in a sense, how is it that we engage in a much fuller way, not only rationally, in the way of thinking our faith, but also how our bodies are fundamental to the processes of creating and doing and undoing the very ways that we believe, how our bodies create and shape the ways we believe, and how our beliefs shape our bodies, and what we believe and what we are supposed to do or not to do. So perhaps I need to think through my body, and my enlightenment, I think, comes from and with the movement of my body, and how, as a theologian in Brazil would say, Jaci Marasquim, the spirit is in my body, so through my body I feel and I am the spirit, not the other way around. So there's no disconnection between one and the other. So I always want to, so in liturgical language we say this, the law of prayer and the law of belief, which is like one feeding the, also the prayer as the gesturing and the movement and the words that creates belief, or is it the belief that creates the prayer? So in many ways, how the body is deeply involved, and what are the markers in the bodies of the believers in relation to other bodies, and avoiding other bodies next to mine as a way of establishing who we are. So the whole sense of identity is deeply marked by how we move, how we allow ourselves to act, to dress, to do certain kind of movements, what we do with our bodies, how our sexualities are so much deeply embedded in our faithful or religious movements as well. So there is this Argentinian theologian, Marcela Altaus-Reed, that she wrote a lot on queer theology, and she has this fantastic title of a book that is, she asks, doing theology without underwear. So in that sense, she is saying there is already a sexualized marker in the theology that we never pay attention to. So, but it is in the body. So it is from this body, from this kind of sexuality that has to do with patriarchy or not, that also helps us to expand the sense of how in our colonialized history we have been racialized and have been deemed proper or improper according to the normative ways of thinking this faith according to some kind of sexuality, some kind of race, some kind of class, and so on and so forth. So what I try to do in my book Eucharist and Hospitality is to put together things that are already there, kind of naming that which is already there but we don't quite realize is there. So how this global society is present in every context, in every local community, and how this forms of being Christian are marked by those global movements as well that also most of the time tends to universalize the sense of belief and not consider the context of where those communities live and how those communities have sources that make them who they are. So the hope there is to name those sources that are very much in there, but we just don't see it because we have this overarching neutral sense of liturgy and theology that we don't pay attention to those things. So my concern is that how ideas shape who we are. So ideas matter. So the things that we say, the things that we do, most of what we have received so far in terms of the of liturgies and liturgical theologies and rituals have a kind of this overarching discourse that does not see the needs of the people who are there. So my call in this book is to call the attention of how we don't perceive the structures of power that are already there. For instance, how the economic of this new liberal world defines the ways in which we worship, we ritualize our faith. So we do talk about, for instance, at the Eucharist, this is the feast of God to the people of God, but this feast has a meager piece of bread and a sip of wine and does not feed people. Or we feed it spiritually. So my call is that, the spiritual goes along with the material. I mean, so it should, everywhere you do the Eucharist, you shouldn't have anybody going hungry, because that is the promise, right? And so how do we have disconnected that way of living together, that with the demand that we have to feed each other, to become just a one way of thinking the doctrine. So who can be in, who can access that, and instead of thinking it from the perspectives of the demands that this gospel makes on us, which is, I cannot eat this food and without my brother and my sister being fully fulfilled. We need, if we're talking about a bountiful table, so let's have food for everybody, and let's feed each other. So this table is about the love of God to humankind. So this love means not only the spiritual fulfillment of my spirit somewhere within me or outside of me or somewhere that I don't quite know, but it is the feeding of the spirit who lives in this body. So the belly, the empty bellies have to do with this call. So and unless we take this call seriously, we are not doing it. So what is most important? It is people going hungry. That is what should define our beliefs, our ways of doing it. Adam, and not being worried about fulfilling a certain ritual that will be good enough for God to fulfill this aspect of our faith. No, it doesn't matter how you do it in many ways. It does matter how you do it fully. At the same time, it doesn't matter if you are not fulfilling that major call to care for your brothers and sisters. So when we share the table, that is a call to share our resources. That is a call that I am responsible for you. So Adam, if you come to the table where I am, or the altar, whatever tradition you are from, and we are supposed to share this table, that means that we are sharing life. That means, Adam, that if you cannot have a place to live, me and everybody else that are responsible for you, and we have to find a shelter for you. If you cannot pay your bills, it is our responsibility. So it is going from this book is about going from the self-enclosed liturgical theological discussion of this ritual, to expand that discussion to consider people who are living very harsh reality. So at the heart of it is what I learned from Professor Cohn, who had the gift to be assistant. Theology starts where it hurts, and so that's where I start. And from there, I will consider everything else. And in that sense, the ritual becomes much more expensive than only a symbolic action of something that we do, but it is the very living of this gospel. So if I am living this Christ event in that Eucharist, in that moment, that means that I have to honor not only God, but I have to honor those who are around me, because this table altar is the connection of the two major commandments: love God with all your hearts and love your neighbor as yourself. So those things must be together. So when I eat, and I have to honor God by honoring somebody who's with me. And if I cannot honor somebody who's with me, so I cannot honor God. This is impossible according to the gospel. So that has to do with the ways in which I see both sacraments. And like baptism, if I am part of this community and your daughter cannot go to college, it's my responsibility. If my people don't have, if baptism is also a way of understanding the healing also that happened in the rituals early on, and we still believe. So that has to do also with healthcare. So how these events have to be brought up to consider those stories. So if you look at my book, there are vignettes everywhere in gray throughout the book about stories of local people. And in some ways, those stories are most important than anything else that I write. And they come right in the midst of the description that I'm doing, just to interrupt our thinking, to pay attention to what really matters, which is people suffering and going through tough times. And so those stories are to orient the way that I think theology, that I think liturgy, that I think all of these other sources. There's so many stories there. Yes, there's one of this mother going in the midst of the war in Iraq, that she leaves her house with her daughter to go buy bread, and there's a bomb that comes from one of the U.S. attacks and kills this girl. Then here's the mother with the pieces of this daughter. How do I thank God from there? How do I thank this table from there? The mother who's going to buy bread. How do I do? Or another story of how this family is coming to U.S. And you see, people come to U.S. not because of any dream. They come because they go where the money is. In Latin America, Brazil now has a little bit more of the money, so everybody's going to Brazil. People don't go because of any dream of any kind. They go because they need to survive. So here's a family coming, and then there is this story of this helicopter of the immigration board that comes and just makes this anxiety go on, and all of this dust coming up, and everybody runs everywhere because they're scared. And so the mothers get lost from their kids. And now their kids are in the midst of the desert, not knowing where to go. What am I going to do to thank this bountiful love of God in the face of a child and a mother in different places, lost in the desert? That really matters. And so there are lots of vignettes, many of them, reminding us that if the rituals that we do are not connected to those who are in tragic situations, there's no reason for us to do it. There's no honoring God whatsoever. Even if you dressed up properly, if you follow the liturgy A, B, C to Z in the most perfect way, that doesn't matter for me. If you are not paying attention to those who are hurting, to those who are losing their lives. Yeah, John Calvin was, I grew up Presbyterian, and so Calvin was fundamental to my ways of growing up and believing, right? To my identity. So I needed to wrestle with this because this is my source of one of my sources, that a boy in Latin America grows up with this French guy who lives in Switzerland and shapes who I am with my family. So I had to deal with it. And it was a fantastic way of engaging Calvin, because then I realized that then Calvin can be brought into this way of thinking. If you look at his life and how he took care of the, of course, there's a lot of tragedies about Reformation and Calvin too, that we have to wrestle with. But there's one aspect of Calvin which is like he was immigrant himself in Switzerland. So he took care of the immigrant. So that was important for me to deal with immigrants as well. And then going into his thinking, and so you have two Calvins there, right? Which is a lot of people would just, in the field, would just say no to me, but I do believe there's two Calvins. One that thinks, and my take on him was on the Holy Spirit. And so there's one way in which he sees the Holy Spirit as organizing the faith and the community and how to live accordingly. But there is other aspect of Calvin who sees the Holy Spirit as free. God's sovereignty cannot be tamed or organized by our own sense of order that is so prevalent in what Reformed churches do today. So I fly with him under this sense of this sovereignty, this freedom, and so from him I see that I learned this right from him and from other theologians then, and weave him with other theologians and correct him from the words of my sisters, of my Black brothers and sisters, from my Latina sisters, and from my queer brothers and sisters, and so then correcting Calvin in some ways. But one thing that I think I gained from this engaging with Calvin is this sense of that comes from Augustine as well, is the sense of freedom. I am not to protect God from the world. I'm not to protect God from those who are doing bad things. I just have to see in what ways I will honor God as I honor my brothers and sisters. And so I'm free. So that's why in the book I try to, at the last chapter, so that's why I have the freedom, for instance, in one of my chapters, to go with an African Brazilian religion, Candomblé, Yoruba, and I go there. And when I go there, I have to undo myself to learn other ways that I learned growing up that was the devil. So having this freedom and this trust that God loves me, I can go anywhere. Once I know that I have my Jesus, I can be with anybody. I can, and I can be at peace. So that's why I wrestle with the sense of this interreligious dialogue with this African Brazilian, because of the sense of the sovereignty of God that I got from Calvin. And then the last chapter is about ritualizing from the critical theory of ritual theory, and then try to create possibilities for these people to be part of this table. So then my hope is that theologians, liturgists, they will be what Gramsci, this Italian thinker, said, organic intellectuals. So I call people that should be organic liturgists, organic theologians. So you go into the ground, you live with people, and you bring all of the source that you learned in the academy, all of this beautiful tradition and so on, and then you put these things together. But these things for the sake of the people, not the people for the sake of this thing. So this is what I try to do. And in that way, putting them together, serving the poor because of the love of God, then we can redraw the lines of the Eucharistic space, the Eucharistic hospitality, from the perspective of those in need and not from the perspective of the tradition only. All I do is a joke in some ways. That's my paper 2 days ago was about we've always been a farce. The name America comes from splendid sources of liars and obscure translators and ridiculous designations. For instance, the guy who wrote the letter Novus Mundus, which is New World, he was this very obscure guy called Américo Vespuccio, who, is not even close to what Christopher Columbus was, or Pero Vaz de Caminha. So this guy just wants to be famous. And so we never know if he wrote it or if somebody else wrote, or if he just disguised himself as the one who wrote it. So we start there. And then there is this Giocondo. Giocondo is this guy who translates the letter from Italian to Latin. And Giocondo means the joker, the trickster. So we have the name being forged by first one a liar, then one a joker. And then the guy who's going to give the name to us is an obscure cartographer who called himself the wooden mill of the lake. Who just said, well, you know, there's Amerigo Vespucci is a nice guy. Let's give the name of the continent because of him. But just make it female instead of male. So then, like a year after Christopher Columbus dies, he realized that he had made a huge mistake. And he tries to call it back, but it's too late. The word America has great sound, and everybody's talking about America now. So even Emerson will say this is the tragedy of this country, of the continent, because we are named after a liar. And the worst thing that ends the joke of who we are, and we are this joke, right? The result of this joke, and is when United States then kidnapped the whole entire continent, word America, and calls itself America. Forgetting that there is Canada, there is Mexico, there is Central America, there is South America, and so the name is kidnapped. So I think this is pretty funny. I know it's not, but just like we are a farce in that regard, right? And by the way, the name was already from the German. It meant people owning land and people owning people. That's a prophecy, isn't it? How people came and stole the land from the indigenous nations, and how we have become. So in some ways, I think all we do is always we continue with that tradition, and every construction of knowledge in some ways is a farce. Every theology is already a mistake. So I love what Octavio Paz said. This thinker from Mexico. He said, "I want people to think with my jokes and laugh with my thoughts." So that's it.